All right, so here's the setup. I'm 26, and a few years ago I inherited my grandma's house. But it's not just any house. It's the place where I grew up with my 3 younger siblings. It's an old farmhouse with plenty of space, a lot of quirks, and a ton of memories. My grandma left it to me with a purpose in mind. She wasn't just passing down property. She was entrusting me with a legacy. I was the oldest, and she wanted me to keep the family together, especially if anything ever happened to her. And she was right to, because when she passed, my siblings needed someone to hold things together. Back then, they were all still underage. My sister Lyla was 20, my brother Josh was 16, and the youngest Ben was only 13. None of us were really prepared for losing Grandma. She'd been the only real parent figure we had. Her death hit us hard, and though I wasn't exactly ready to take on the role of head of the household, I knew they needed me, and that's what mattered. So I moved back in, took on legal guardianship of my siblings, and did my best to do what Grandma would have wanted. This house meant the world to her, and I know she left it to keep us all grounded, to give us a safe space we could always come back to. It's not just bricks and wood, it's the home where we all grew up, where every creak in the floor and every bit of peeling paint has a story attached. Now, this isn't some fancy place, not by a long shot. It's an old farmhouse, with all the quirks that come with that. The plumbing is ancient, the paint's chipped, and the floors creak like you wouldn't believe. But I grew up with it, and those imperfections just feel like part of the house's personality. There's even a barn out back that's somehow part of the family's story, which brings us to one of the quirks that's actually turned into a bit of an issue. See, when Grandma was still around, she decided to turn the barn into a kind of guest house. It was her idea that family or friends could stay there whenever they visited. Over time, though, it sort of became a storage spot for random junk nobody wanted to deal with. There's a bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a bathroom in there, but they're all buried under boxes, furniture, and all kinds of old stuff. To be honest, I don't even know if anything in there works anymore, and I'm definitely not in a position to renovate it. Money's tight as it is, just keeping up with the regular bills and the kids' expenses. Taking over the house and suddenly being in charge of 3 younger siblings was overwhelming at first. One day I was worrying about my own life and plans, and the next, I was managing a household with teenagers and trying to be a stable presence for them. There were plenty of moments where I doubted if I was doing the right thing or if I could even handle it. But in the end, it felt like what Grandma would have wanted, and I didn't want to let her down. Each sibling is different, which keeps things interesting. Lyla, my 20-year-old sister, is in college now and has her own opinions about how things should work around here. Josh, who's 16, is a classic teenage boy, glued to his phone or Xbox whenever he's not at school. And then there's Ben, the youngest, who's still figuring himself out at 13. Trying to be a responsible guardian while still feeling like an older sibling is a delicate balance, but we're managing. It's not perfect, but it works. It's funny because when I was younger, I never imagined myself in this role. But something changed when Grandma passed. I remember her telling me once, "Family is who you take care of." That's always stayed with me. So here I am, doing my best to take care of the people who mean the most to me, in the house that means so much to all of us. Our life here is simple but busy. The kids go to school, I handle the house, and every day is just about keeping things steady. Sure, there are days I miss having my own space, my freedom, but living here feels right. It feels like honoring Grandma's memory. The barn, though, that's a different story. It's no longer the guest house Grandma envisioned. It's more like a glorified junkyard now. No one stayed in it for years, and someone broke into it a while back, leaving the door without a lock. Fixing that is just one more thing on a never-ending to-do list, and honestly, it's a low priority. The place has become a museum of random junk at this point. If you tried to walk through it, you'd be knee-deep in boxes and old furniture before you even saw the bed. Renovating it would take time, money, and energy, all of which are in short supply right now. So it just sits there, full of things we don't have the heart to throw away. So that's where we're at. I've got this old house, the responsibility of 3 siblings, and a barn that's pretty much useless at this point. But this place means something to all of us, and I'm doing everything I can to keep it together. It's not perfect, but it's home, and I'm determined to make sure it stays that way. Grandma left me this place because she believed I'd look out for my siblings, and I'm not about to let her down. Everything was going about as well as it could, given the circumstances. But then, I shared some news that changed everything. I told them I was pregnant. I figured my siblings would be supportive, or at least a little excited. But my sister Lyla, the one I thought might be the most understanding, just stared at me like I'd announced we were all moving to another planet. The next day, she pulled me aside for a serious talk. "I just want you to know," she started, with a tone that felt way too serious for a conversation with her sister. "I don't think I can live here with a baby." I was caught off guard. It's not like I'd asked her to co-parent or anything. Trying to stay calm, I asked her what exactly she meant. She went on to explain that she wasn't down for living with a newborn, saying the noise would disrupt her routine and mess with her studies. Now, mind you, this is the same sister who blasts music at midnight and invites friends over for study sessions that are anything but quiet. So I tried to be understanding, thinking maybe she was just stressed with college and all. I reassured her, telling her we could make it work and even find ways to keep things quiet for her. But then she hit me with, "Why don't you just move into the barn?" At first, I laughed. I honestly thought she was joking. Moving into a dusty, spider-infested barn while pregnant and with a newborn? It sounded ridiculous, but she was dead serious. She kept going on about how practical it would be, saying she and the younger ones needed their sleep, and it would be better for everyone if I just took my little bundle of noise to the barn. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. She was really suggesting I move out of my own house, the house Grandma left to me, and live in a barn. I told her straight up, the barn hasn't been touched in years. It's a storage room with a bed buried under piles of junk. I don't even know if the plumbing works back there. She just shrugged, like I was the one being difficult. "You're overreacting," she said. "It wouldn't take much to make it livable again. Just clear out the junk, add a few cozy touches, and voila, a perfect little barn apartment." She even offered to help me move, as if she were doing me some big favor. I couldn't tell if she genuinely believed this was a good idea or if she was just desperate to avoid having a baby around. Either way, I wasn't having it. I told her flat out that I wasn't moving into the barn. This house was left to me, and I intended to stay here, especially since I was the one responsible for everyone, including her. But Lyla didn't back down. She accused me of being selfish, saying if I cared about the family, I'd make this small sacrifice. I couldn't believe it. Moving into a storage shed so she wouldn't have to hear a baby cry was a small sacrifice. I asked her why she didn't move into the barn if she liked the idea so much. She hit me with, "This is my home too. I have every right to be here." And honestly, she's got a point. I do want my siblings to feel at home here, but it's absurd to make me feel like I'm imposing in my own house. I kept explaining that I needed to be under the same roof as our younger siblings to look after them, but she acted like the baby was some huge inconvenience she shouldn't have to deal with, even if it meant asking me to leave the house. And that's where things started spiraling. Every conversation would circle back to the barn idea. She'd make comments like, "Well, it wouldn't hurt to at least look at the barn," or, "If you cleared out the junk, it could be nice." It was like she thought that if she brought it up enough, I'd eventually agree. After I told Lyla I wasn't moving into the barn, things took a turn. She's not the type to give up easily, and her approach quickly shifted from just talking about the barn to trying to make her point in other ways. She didn't come right out and argue with me, but every other conversation would somehow circle back to practical ways I could use the barn, like it was this untapped paradise. And each time, I'd tell her no, just as firmly as before. At first, she seemed to brush it off, but soon, her attitude started seeping into everything around the house. Little things changed, the kind of stuff that's not quite bad enough to call out, but annoying enough to notice. She started leaving her things scattered around. Bags and clothes dropped all over the living room, textbooks open on the kitchen table. This was a complete switch for her. Usually, she's the one who nags everyone about keeping things clean. It felt like she was trying to take over every corner of the house, marking her territory like I was some kind of intruder. And it didn't stop there. Suddenly, there were piles of dishes left in the sink, too. Lyla was always the one who insisted everyone clean up right away, so it was hard to see this as anything but intentional. I'd walk into the kitchen to find plates and cups stacked up, all left for me to handle. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping she'd cool off once she saw I wasn't giving in. But if anything, the mess got worse, and the tension in the house became unbearable. Finally, I sat her down, hoping we could clear the air. I kept it simple, telling her, "Look, I know you're not happy with the situation, but we need to find a way to get along here." She just shrugged, barely looking at me, and said, "I'm not the one making it a problem." It took everything in me not to roll my eyes at that, but what really started getting under my skin was how she acted around Josh and Ben. They're both at ages where they pick up on everything, and lately, she's been making these passive-aggressive comments, always just loud enough for me to hear. Things like, "Well, I guess some people get to decide everything now," or "Must be nice to call all the shots." She didn't say it directly to me, of course, always with a tone that suggested she was just making casual remarks. But Josh and Ben were starting to notice. One night, Ben, the youngest, came to me and asked, "Why is Lyla so mad at you?" I didn't want to drag him into it, so I just told him, "We're having a disagreement. Nothing you need to worry about." But I could see it bothered him. He's been quieter than usual, avoiding being in the same room with both of us at once. Josh, on the other hand, has just kept his head down, trying to stay out of it altogether. The whole thing broke my heart because I never wanted any of them to feel caught in the middle. The tension escalated even further one day when I asked Lyla to watch Josh and Ben for a couple of hours while I ran some errands. She straight up refused, saying she had too much homework. Funny, since she was literally watching TV when I asked, so I had to scramble to make other arrangements. It wasn't the end of the world, but it felt like yet another reminder that she was trying to make everything harder than it needed to be. Then came the digs, little jabs about freeloaders, or how some people don't contribute as much as others. I knew she was trying to imply that I was somehow taking advantage of the house, which was honestly ridiculous since she was living here rent-free herself. I wanted to say something back, to remind her that I'm the one keeping everything running, but I didn't want to escalate things. It was getting harder and harder to keep my cool, though. The final straw came one night while I was making dinner. She came into the kitchen sighing dramatically every few seconds. At first I ignored it, but then she said, "I was planning to study tonight, but I guess I'll just have to deal with all the noise." I had to laugh at that one, mainly because the house was dead quiet aside from the cooking sounds, and the baby wasn't even born yet. I looked at her and calmly said, "Look, I get that you're frustrated, but can we at least try to coexist without the attitude?" She just rolled her eyes and walked out of the room. It felt like I was dealing with a teenager instead of a 20-year-old adult. The silent treatment and little games kept going. She'd barely look at me when she walked through a room, giving one-word answers whenever I tried to start a conversation. It was like living with a ghost who was mad at me. I figured she'd eventually get over it, but instead, she just doubled down. She barely talked to the younger kids either, and they were definitely starting to notice. Ben, who's always been close to her, was especially affected. He kept asking me why she was acting so distant, and it was hard to explain in a way that wouldn't make him worry. Then one evening, I tried to bring back a bit of normalcy by planning a family movie night. I picked out a movie we all liked, got snacks ready, and invited everyone to join. Josh and Ben were on board immediately, and I hoped maybe Lyla would soften up a bit, but instead of coming out to join us, she just stayed in her room with the door shut. The kids kept glancing at the door, hoping she'd join us, but she didn't. It was like she wanted to make a point of excluding herself. After the movie, Josh asked, "Did Lyla say why she didn't come out?" I just shook my head trying to brush it off, but inside I was fuming. Ignoring me was one thing, but ignoring the rest of the family felt petty and hurtful. The next morning, she pulled another stunt that nearly made me lose my patience. I was making breakfast for everyone and, out of habit, asked her if she wanted any. She ignored me, so I went about my business. Then she came into the kitchen, made her own breakfast right next to me, and left without a word. The silence was suffocating. It felt like living with a stranger who went out of their way to make me feel unwelcome. Finally, I decided to address it directly, hoping to break through this wall of silence. "Lyla," I said, "I know we're not on the best terms right now, but this is getting ridiculous. We're family, and the way you're acting is affecting everyone else too." She stared at me for a moment, like she was considering saying something, but then just shrugged and walked away. It was clear that she wasn't going to budge, and that's when I realized I needed to stop bending over backward to keep the peace. I'd been trying to tiptoe around her, hoping things would improve, but that wasn't getting us anywhere. I had every right to stay in this house, and I wasn't about to be pushed out of it, especially not by someone who was supposed to be my family. So I decided to take a different approach. Instead of letting her mood control the entire house, I started focusing on keeping things steady and positive for Josh and Ben. I told them they didn't have to walk on eggshells just because she was upset, and they seemed relieved. I think they'd been picking up on my tension and were worried they needed to tread lightly too. The next time she came into the kitchen with her usual silent treatment, I didn't let it faze me. I just went on talking to Josh and Ben, asking about their day and sharing stories. We started laughing and joking, and for a moment it felt like things were back to normal. A few days later, I set up a family movie night again, and this time I didn't even bother inviting her. Josh and Ben and I settled in with popcorn, dimmed the lights, and started watching. But just as the movie was beginning, Lyla appeared in the doorway, looking a little uncertain. She stood there for a moment, as if debating whether to join or go back to her room. Normally, I would have extended an olive branch and invited her to join us, but this time I didn't say anything. I didn't even look her way. Finally, she shuffled over and sat at the far end of the couch. She didn't say a word, but at least she was there. I figured that was progress, in its own strange way. The next morning, though, she was back to stomping around the house, sighing and slamming doors as if she wanted everyone to know she was still upset. Honestly, it was almost funny at that point. How much energy did she think I had to keep caring about every sigh and eye roll? I had enough on my plate with getting ready for the baby and managing things with Josh and Ben. If Lyla wanted to sulk, that was on her, but I wasn't going to let her drag everyone else down. I could see her noticing too. She glanced at us a few times with a flash of surprise, almost like she wasn't used to her silent treatment not affecting everyone. And that's when I knew things were shifting. For once, I didn't feel like I had to keep fighting to stay in my own home. I was here to stay, with my siblings, my future child, and my family, whether she liked it or not. Living under the same roof with Lyla had become a daily endurance test. After she realized I wasn't going to budge on the barn issue, she upped the ante. Her silent treatment escalated to new heights, making it crystal clear that she wasn't just mad. She wanted me to feel every ounce of her anger. She stopped talking to me altogether, acting as if I were invisible. I'd walk into a room and she'd leave. I'd say something and she wouldn't even look up. If I asked a direct question, I might get a half-hearted yeah or no, but that was it. It was like living with a ghost who was out to haunt me. At first, I hoped it would blow over, that maybe she'd need a few days to cool off and we'd talk it out like adults. But no, she was committed to her silent protest, like it was her new mission in life. And it wasn't just me she was avoiding. She even started keeping her distance from Josh and Ben, which hit them hard, especially Ben. He's always been close to her, and seeing her avoid him was confusing for him. She wouldn't even sit in the same room with him if I was there, and that hurt him more than I think she realized. What was wild was how she managed to ignore me while still making her presence known. She'd slam doors, stomp around the house, and create just enough noise to remind me she was there, and that she was angry. It felt like she was trying to let me know without saying a word that her silence was a punishment. I kept wondering if she was expecting me to break, to come to her and say, "Fine, I'll move to the barn." But that was never going to happen. One night I was in the kitchen making dinner, and she came in. I thought, maybe this is her finally ready to talk. So I tried breaking the ice, asking, "Hey, do you want pasta or rice tonight?" She just looked at me like I'd asked her to solve a complex math problem, then turned and walked right out of the room without saying a thing. It was as if basic human interaction was beneath her now. Meanwhile, Josh and Ben were trying to navigate the tension too. Josh kept his head down, mostly staying in his room or out with friends, but Ben, he was struggling. He'd ask me questions like, "Why won't she talk to us? Did we do something wrong?" I hated seeing him worry, so I just told him it was a grown-up disagreement, and nothing he needed to stress about. But he wasn't buying it. I could see him withdrawing, spending more time alone in his room. It hurt to watch him feel like he was caught in the middle of something that wasn't his fault. One evening, after another especially icy day, I decided I needed to reassure him. I sat him down and told him, "Listen, Ben, everything's okay. Sometimes people disagree, but it has nothing to do with you. You don't need to worry about it." He looked at me, and I could see the worry in his eyes. "I don't like it when she's mad," he said quietly. And honestly, I didn't know what else to say. He's just a kid, and he shouldn't have to carry the weight of this mess. Lyla, meanwhile, kept up her silent protest, locking herself in her room or disappearing for hours on end. She'd only come back late at night, making a show of how little she wanted to be here. It was like she was a guest in her own home, and it made everything feel so strained. We were all just surviving under the same roof, without any real peace. Things reached a new low when I tried to set up a family movie night. It was something we used to do all the time, and I hoped it might bring a bit of normalcy back to the house. I picked out a movie that everyone liked, got some snacks together, and invited them to join. Josh and Ben were on board right away, and I thought maybe, just maybe, Lyla would join us too. But predictably, she didn't even respond. She stayed in her room with the door shut, pretending like she didn't hear a thing. The kids kept glancing at her door, wondering if she was going to join us, and I could see the disappointment in their faces. After the movie, Josh asked, "Did she say why she didn't come out?" I shook my head and tried to play it off, but inside I was fuming. Ignoring me was one thing, but ignoring her brothers felt petty. It was like she was willing to make everyone uncomfortable just to keep her grudge alive. The next day, she pulled another stunt that almost made me lose my patience. I was making breakfast for everyone and, out of habit, asked if she wanted any. She ignored me, of course, so I went about my business. Then, just as I was finishing, she came into the kitchen, made her own breakfast right beside me, and left without a word. It was like she was making a point to show me how much she didn't care. Living in this tension was exhausting, and I was beginning to wonder how much more I could take without snapping. Finally, I had enough. I decided to talk to her one last time. "Lyla, I know we're not on the best terms right now, but this is getting ridiculous. We're still family, and your attitude is affecting everyone else too." She stared at me for a moment, like she was debating saying something, but then she just shrugged and walked off. That was it. No acknowledgement, no attempt at compromise, nothing. It was then that I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around, trying to keep the peace for her sake. If she was determined to sulk, that was on her, but I wasn't going to let her mood ruin the entire house. I decided to focus on keeping things positive for Josh and Ben, making sure they didn't feel like they were living in a minefield. I told them that we didn't need to walk on eggshells and that it was okay to just live as usual, even if she was upset. They both seemed relieved, especially Ben, who looked like a weight had been lifted. The next time Lyla came into the kitchen with her usual silent treatment, I didn't let it bother me. I went on talking with Josh and Ben, laughing and joking with them just like before. And for a moment, it felt like things were normal again. I could tell she noticed, too. I saw her glancing over as if surprised that her silence wasn't affecting everyone. It was like she wasn't used to her mood not controlling the entire atmosphere of the house. A few days later, I set up another family movie night. This time, I didn't even bother inviting her. The kids and I settled in with popcorn, dimmed the lights, and started watching. Just as the movie began, Lyla appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain. She paused, hesitating as if trying to decide whether to join or retreat to her room. Normally, I would have waved her over, but this time I didn't. I just let her make her own choice. After a few seconds, she finally shuffled over and sat at the far end of the couch. She didn't say a word, but at least she was there. It felt like a tiny step forward. The next morning, she was back to her routine of stomping around and sighing dramatically. But this time, I didn't let it get to me. I had more important things to focus on, getting ready for the baby, making sure the kids felt secure, and keeping the house running smoothly. If she wanted to sulk, that was her choice, but I wasn't going to let it drag me down. That's when I realized that I'd reached a turning point. I didn't have to keep bending over backward to keep her happy. I'd done my best to make this house a home for all of us, and if she couldn't see that, then that was on her. She could keep throwing her silent protest, but I wasn't going anywhere. This house was my home as much as it was hers, and I had every right to stay. From then on, I put my energy into making life as normal and positive as possible for Josh and Ben. They deserved to feel safe and happy in their own home, and I wasn't about to let Lyla's anger ruin that. I could see her watching, as if trying to understand why her cold shoulder wasn't breaking me down. The more I ignored her passive-aggressive games, the less power her attitude seemed to have. For the first time in a while, I felt a sense of peace. I'd spent so much energy trying to accommodate her, to keep things smooth and peaceful. But now I saw that wasn't possible unless we both made an effort. And I was done bending. She could come around when she was ready, but I wasn't going to wait for her. I was here, with my family, my child on the way, and the life I was building, whether she liked it or not. The tension between Lyla and me had settled into this uneasy truce of sorts. At least, that's what I thought. But the silent treatment and passive-aggressive standoffs were wearing everyone down, especially the younger kids. Ben, the youngest, was picking up on every little moment of tension, and I could see him growing more withdrawn. Josh was avoiding both of us as much as possible, which only made the atmosphere feel heavier. And honestly, I think the whole thing was starting to get to Lyla too, even if she wouldn't admit it. One day, out of the blue, she came to me with an announcement. She'd barely been home lately, spending most of her time at a friend's place or anywhere that wasn't here. So when she walked into the kitchen and sat down with this serious look on her face, I knew she had something to say. She cleared her throat and finally said, "I don't think this arrangement is working out for me. Maybe it's time I find my own place." At first, I was relieved. Maybe this would give us both some breathing room, finally putting an end to the constant friction. But I knew it wouldn't be easy for her. She's a college student on a tight budget, and finding affordable housing around here is a tall order. I could see the doubt in her eyes, but I kept my mouth shut. If she thought this was what she needed, I wanted to support her decision. Over the next week, I watched her scrolling through rental listings on her phone and messaging people about shared housing. I overheard her calling friends, asking if they knew anyone looking for a roommate. But it didn't take long for reality to set in. Rent was high, and the places within her budget were either way out of town or in sketchy neighborhoods. Every day she came home looking more frustrated, and I knew it was starting to sink in that living on her own wasn't going to be as easy as she'd thought. One night, she plopped down at the kitchen table with a deep sigh, looking fed up. "Do you know how hard it is to find a decent place around here?" She grumbled, more to herself than to me. Everyone wants an arm and a leg for a place that isn't even half this size. It was the first time I'd seen her vulnerable since this whole mess started. She looked tired, worn down from the stress of trying to find a new place. And for a moment, I felt a bit of sympathy. I didn't say much, just nodded and let her vent. I think she was finally starting to realize that the grass wasn't always greener on the other side. Eventually, she admitted, "Maybe I was a little rash." Her voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on the table. "I thought getting away would fix everything, but it's not as simple as I thought." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "Look, Lyla, no one's pushing you out. I know things have been rough, but we don't have to keep making it so hard on each other. This is home for all of us. We can make it work, but it has to be a team effort." She was quiet for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah, maybe I've been making things harder than they need to be." It was the first time she sounded like herself in weeks, and for a moment, it felt like we were finally getting somewhere. But just when I thought things might be easing up, she pulled me right back into the old patterns. A few days later, she was back to her usual silent treatment, stomping around the house and making sure I knew she was still upset. It was exhausting, and it felt like every tiny step forward came with 2 steps back. The breaking point came one afternoon while I was setting up a small nursery area in my room. I was moving boxes and rearranging things to make space, and she happened to walk by. She stopped in the doorway, looking over the baby things with that same annoyed expression she'd been giving me for weeks. She didn't say anything. She just watched me struggle with the boxes, almost like she was daring me to ask for help. But I didn't. I kept going, determined to finish on my own without asking her for anything. Finally, as if she couldn't hold back any longer, she stormed into my room, her voice practically shaking with anger. "This whole thing is selfish," she said, her tone sharp. "You're disrupting everything, making it all about you and the baby. You're not respecting my boundaries." I felt a surge of frustration rise up, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'd reached my limit too. So I looked at her and said, "Lyla, this is my house. I'm done feeling guilty for simply living here. I'm trying to do what's best for the family, and that includes preparing for my child. Grandma left me this place with a purpose, and I'm not going to ignore that just to keep the peace." Her face twisted in frustration, and she shot back, "You're just trying to kick me out. You're being selfish and unreasonable." But this time, instead of defending myself or trying to explain further, I simply told her the truth. "If you can't handle the changes, you're free to find another arrangement." I even offered to help her look for an affordable place if she needed it. But I made it clear that I wasn't going to keep fighting over this. She could either accept the situation or she could leave. For the first time, she went completely quiet. I could tell my words had struck a nerve. She stood there for a moment, processing what I'd said, and then without another word, she walked out of the room. And while I felt a little guilty deep down, I knew this needed to be said. I didn't want her to feel unwelcome, but I couldn't keep sacrificing my own peace of mind and my child's future just to avoid her tantrums. After that conversation, things started to shift. Lyla wasn't warm with me, and I didn't expect her to be anytime soon, but she backed off. The constant passive-aggressive moves stopped. The tension was still there, lingering in the background, but it was muted and quieter. We were finally finding a way to exist in the same space without all the drama. The younger kids seemed to notice too. They weren't tiptoeing around as much, and I could see them relaxing, relieved that things were getting back to some kind of normal, even if it wasn't perfect. As for Lyla, she still kept her distance, but it felt different. Like she'd finally accepted that this was the reality, whether she liked it or not. She'd retreat to her room or leave for hours at a time, but the snide comments and the silent protest had faded. I think she realized that I wasn't going to cave and that I wasn't going anywhere. This house was mine, and I was here to stay with my baby and my siblings regardless of her attitude. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was better than constantly bending over backward to keep her happy. Maybe, in time, she'd come around. Maybe she'd understand that this house was big enough for all of us, baby included. But if not, I'd made my peace with that too. I was done with the endless cycles of guilt and resentment. This was my home, and I had every right to be here. So for now, we were finding a way to coexist. Maybe it wasn't the perfect ending, but it was a start. And if nothing else, I felt stronger for standing my ground, knowing I could protect this home and my family, even in the face of all the noise and tension. This was my place, my life, and I was ready to keep moving forward, no matter what came next. After I laid down those boundaries, things actually got better, at least for a while. Lyla had stopped with the passive-aggressive comments, and even though she still kept her distance, the house finally felt livable again. The younger kids were back to their normal selves, and I felt like we'd settled into a new rhythm. There was still tension hanging in the air, but it was manageable. I could live with that. A few months went by, and things stayed mostly quiet. I focused on preparing for the baby's arrival and tried to bring a sense of peace back to the house. The kids and I found a new routine, and while Lyla wasn't exactly a part of it, she wasn't disrupting it either. I started to think that maybe we'd finally reached a point where we could coexist. Then, one evening, Lyla came into the kitchen while I was cooking. It had been a long day, and I wasn't in the mood for another round of silent treatment. But this time, something was different. She seemed hesitant, almost like she was unsure of herself. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, watching me go about making dinner. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and unsteady. "I think I've made things harder than they needed to be," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "I thought getting away would fix everything, but I didn't realize how much I'd be giving up." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. This was the first time she'd shown any real vulnerability since our argument started. It was like a crack in the wall she'd built up, a glimpse of the sister I'd known before all of this tension and resentment had taken over. "I get it," I said finally, keeping my voice calm. "Change is hard, and I know the baby is going to make things different around here. But that doesn't mean we can't make this work." She looked at me, and I could see a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "I guess I just didn't want to feel like I was being pushed out of my own home," she admitted. "But I didn't realize that's how I was making you feel too." We stood there in silence for a while, both of us letting her words sink in. It was a strange, vulnerable moment, one I wasn't sure we'd ever reach. After everything, I think we both realized that this was about more than just the barn or the baby. It was about finding a way to share this space, to make it work for both of us without feeling like we were losing something in the process. Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to change. Lyla and I weren't suddenly best friends, but we were talking again, little by little. The younger kids seemed to sense the shift too, and they started to relax even more. We started doing family activities again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house felt like home again. One evening, we were all sitting around the table talking and laughing, and I realized how far we'd come. Lyla was still guarded, but she was there, present, and engaged. And that meant a lot, especially after all the tension and hurt feelings we'd been through. As for the barn, it stayed the way it was, our makeshift storage space full of memories and random belongings. But every now and then, Lyla would bring up the idea of fixing it up, making it a real guest house like Grandma had intended. And maybe someday we'll do that, and turn it into something we can all use and appreciate. But for now, it was enough just to have a bit of peace in the main house, to feel like we were moving forward, however slowly. I don't know what the future holds. Life has a way of throwing surprises at you when you least expect it, and I'm sure there'll be challenges down the road. But I've learned a lot through all of this, about boundaries, about family, and about standing up for myself. I've learned that it's okay to put my needs first sometimes, especially when it comes to my own home and my own family. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on solid ground. This house is mine, and I've made peace with the fact that it's my responsibility to protect it, to make it a place where everyone feels safe. Grandma left me this place because she trusted me to keep the family together, and despite everything, I think I've managed to honor that. Lyla and I still have a long way to go, and we're both figuring out what it means to share this space with a new dynamic on the horizon. But we're learning, and that's enough for now. We're family, after all, and family isn't always easy, but it's worth fighting for. As I sit here feeling the baby move for the first time, I know that no matter what happens next, I'll be ready. This house, this life, it's where I'm meant to be. And maybe, just maybe, we'll all find a way to make it work.